You're listening to All Kinds of Catholic with me, Teresa Alessandro. My conversations with different Catholics will give you glimpses into some of the ways we're living our faith today. Pope Leo, quoting St. Augustine, reminds us, "Let us live well, and the times will be good. We are the times." I hope you'll feel encouraged and affirmed, and sometimes challenged, as I am in these conversations. Join our podcast community, get news and background information about the conversations, and share your thoughts if you want to. You can get the newsletter and each episode straight to your inbox by going to allkindsofcatholic.substack.com and clicking on subscribe. It's free. That web address is in the episode notes too, and I'd love you to draw closer to our community. Thank you. Listeners, if you've been going to Buzzsprout to find the podcast, you'll notice it's no longer being updated there. Everything is now on Substack, allkindsofcatholic.substack.com, and on all the usual podcast platforms for listening. Today's guest is Claire. There are snippets of God working in Claire's life from the beginning, but you'll hear she's someone who didn't become a Catholic until quite late on. You'll also hear that Claire is a trans woman, and we talk about what a toxic theme this is in today's world. So I hope this conversation is helpful for you, as it has been for me. Listeners, thank you for joining the episode today. I'm joined by Claire. You've many years of life experience to share with us, Claire, but we're going to start with little tiny you in the Welsh Valleys. Tell us a bit about your childhood then. We were just saying that you grew up in a family who were not Christian. Tell us what that was like.
I never, ever could remember my parents, my mother and father, ever involved in any form of religion. We lived with my grandmother in her big house, which she rented. My gran was actually an active member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, which was not too unusual in those days, especially in the South Wales valleys and coalfields. She was a widow. She had 7 children. So it was a struggle for my grandmother, and she took in a lodger, as I understood, Philip. Now, Philip was from County Waterford and a devout Catholic. So I experienced through Philip this mystery, the church, because Philip had the job of going to the presbytery house in a small, tiny Catholic church in the village where I was brought up to look after the priest's allotment. What was interesting about that, the church, as far as I can remember, was mainly Irish and Italian immigrants into the valleys, into the South Wales coalfield. Certainly Welsh people weren't generally. You'd have to go hunting to find a Welsh Catholic born and bred in Wales, because it was heavily dominated by the nonconformist churches.
That is interesting, Claire. There's some similarities with parts of the church today.
Anyway, me being a toddler, Uncle Phil, I suppose, was like a surrogate grandfather to me. He used to take me up to the allotments. But every time we went to the allotments, I can remember we went into church. There was a beautiful statue of Our Lady with a row of candles underneath. And we always lit a candle, and Philip said a prayer to Our Lady, and I was with it. That must have been quite a big impression on my life.
You didn't go to a Catholic school or anything, or a faith school?
Oh gosh, not at all. In school, we used to have, like lots of schools, I suppose, 5 religious assemblies a week, which were Christian. But the singing was great. I think that influenced me a lot.
When do you think you started to think about God working in your life then? Was there a point that you can say you began to be conscious of that?
Probably about 2000. I don't know how I got involved in it, but I kind of found St. Bino's Spirituality Centre, which is in North Wales.
St. Bino's, Claire? Oh, that's the Jesuits then.
I remember looking in the retreat guide, the National Retreat Guide, and what was interesting about St. Bino's was they welcomed LGBT people and listeners. I identify as a trans woman. So I felt, that looks like a safe place to go. And I did. And one of the Jesuit priests, at one occasion when I was there, we did an exercise which was looking where was God present in our life. And in typical Jesuit fashion, He said, let's draw a timeline of your life and divide it into decades. You can explore in your mind where you thought God was present and where he wasn't present. I did that, and reflecting on that first decade, Philip was important in my life as far as God was concerned. And I suppose, in a sense, my grandmother was a big influence on me. And even though that she was a member of the Communist Party, she had a good sense of social well-being, care for others. So I connected the two, and I thought, yeah, God was present in my life at that time. But the downside was, by the time I was about 12, they both died.
Oh, no.
Philip died when I must have been about 8 or 10, I think. Of course, he was ill in the house. He was in bed. I can remember the priest coming, presumably to anoint him and give him communion. Looking back on it, I think that's what was going on. But the Catholic Church in the 50s was very much something mysterious.
I bet it was still in Latin then and things, was it, in the 50s?
Of course, yeah, but I would imagine so. The key thing what happened was the priest came to the house, but he sent us all away. And he went in to see Philip on his own. Presumably, as I said, must have anointed him and given him communion, and off he went. But Philip died so shortly after. I think we went to the funeral as a family, but I can't remember much of that. I can remember my grandmother's funeral because that happened in the house. The coffin was in the house, as was often the tradition in those days. And the coffin was covered by the red flag of the Communist Party.
Very appropriate.
So that was my first decade. God had been present overall.
Was it only reflecting on it then when you were at St Bino's in about 2000 that you were able to sort of see it like that and think about it like that? Or had you always had a kind of idea that God was there?
At that age, it was when I reflected at St Bino's. But God never rests. And it became more obvious in my life in my teenage because my parents moved out of my grandmother's house and bought a little tiny house in another village. I went to a different school around about the time secondary education was starting. A lot of my friends were in the church choir, in the Anglican church choir. I always loved singing, so I went along with them and joined the church choir. And in my teens, I became quite involved in that church. I became a server. I sang in the choir and I went to church on a Sunday, often 3 times. So I really got serious about God and religion in my teens. I ended up actually thinking I was being called to ordained ministry in the Anglican church. But I was also struggling to make sense of my identity because remember, I was brought up as a little boy, but I was confused and I didn't have the language and knowledge to explain what was going on for me. So I felt God was calling me. It was strange that I can't put my finger on why and how, but I had this strong sense I needed to go forward for ordained ministry in the Anglican church, but I couldn't because I was also confused about my gender. And women priests weren't allowed in the Anglican church at that time. So off I goes to university, where I took church seriously, actually. I was very active in the Anglican chaplaincy. I went once or twice to the Catholic chaplaincy in Cardiff University, but I also went every Sunday evening to communion in what they call an Anglo-Catholic church, a very high Anglican church. I left university and I got married to my childhood sweetheart, but there was a religious problem there. She was brought up in an extreme, narrow Protestant church. I remember when we got married, I invited the Anglican vicar on the church I went to. Would he come to the wedding? But he never turned up, and people didn't go to different churches in those days. So we got married, but we could not reconcile my kind of higher Anglicanism and fundamentalist Calvinistic Methodism. So the only solution we could come to was we didn't go to anything. Now that's significant because I didn't go to church from about my early 20s until I transitioned when I was 50.
That is a long time away from church.
30 years. But all that time, I had, in the back of my consciousness, I felt called. And any opportunity to go in any church, really, and pray, I took it. But I didn't practice because we just couldn't get it sorted.
You say that you took opportunities to go into a church and pray, but what about praying just where you are? Did you do that during that time?
I think I must have because I didn't have a formal upbringing in the church from an early age. I suppose I didn't know how to pray, really. I think I must have talked to God and stuff like that. And to some extent, that's what I do now. I quite often have a conversation with God. Sometimes I say, come on, God, get your act together and come and sort me out.
I see, that's how you frame it. Now, can we change the subject a little bit, Claire? Can we talk about, you introduced that you are a trans woman. Can we talk a little bit about how that fits with your faith? I mean, maybe we're jumping in time a little bit, but just something about how your relationship with God is with being trans. Is that something you're able to talk to God about? Is it something you felt God was nudging you towards, or is this a completely different part of your life?
Contrary to a lot of LGBT people, I've never had any problem. I thought God's loved me all my life. I've never felt it was a sin or anything like that, never any guilt. I am aware, and I thought God's very happy with that. Now, a lot of people wouldn't agree with that, but that's how I felt. And that was kind of crystallized because in the early 2000s, I worked with an Anglican priest on a ministry, and it was called the Progressive Christianity Network. We found that we were ironically attracting people from the Anglican Church, the Baptist Church, and United Reformed Church. Sometimes ministers from those churches were struggling in the ministry. And Malcolm and I found that we were essentially running the ministry for priests, ministers of religion who were struggling with their faith. Malcolm was a vicar. He came one August to my house. He said, well, I've got something to tell you. He said, I've just been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer and I've just months to live. So that was quite devastating. I remember going to see Malcolm the week before Christmas that same year, and he was in a hospice. There was Malcolm. He was the happiest person on the ward, even though he was dying. He said, I want to leave you a gift. And he said, I want you to go home and read Psalm 139. So I did, and I was astounded by it because that psalm summed up really my life with God.
Okay, well, we like to hear scripture that means something to our guests, so tell us about that then.
You search me, O Lord, and you know me. You knit me together in my mother's womb. That convinced me God knew me, and my relationship with God was right. And that psalm always moves me and sticks with me.
Thank you for sharing it, and sorry to hear about another loss in your life of someone who was close to you.
Next significant event was when I transitioned at 50, and unfortunately my marriage broke up at the same time. There's loads of reasons for that. But immediately, without any doubt whatsoever, I found a church where I needed to be. And that was an Anglican church, very similar to St. Bino's. I knew was a safe place for LGBT people. There was such a wonderful community in that church. Women in that church saved my life without any doubt. Because I had transitioned, I had surgery, I was both vulnerable and weak physically and psychologically.
Yeah.
Huge changes in my life. And my marriage and family had disintegrated. But these Christian women held me together. I felt again God was calling me, and they felt it. They said, you need to do something about this. And many people in the congregation said the same. I ended up, cut a long story short, being interviewed by the diocesan director of ordination for the first stage in becoming an Anglican priest. So I spent another hour or so explaining all about transness and all that kind of thing and part of my journey. So at the end, he said, "Oh, I don't know how the bishop's going to react to this." And the next thing I knew, I was being summoned to the bishop's palace, and I had a similar interrogation. And he said, "Oh, we'll go away and I'll think about it. I got a message. The bishop wants to see you on Friday." And he said, "No, I've thought about it. I don't want you to be ordained." And that was the end of that part of my journey.
Claire, there's something about you going through that process with those people who received you and discussed it with you. It's put something in their mind to think about these issues and people in these situations that they perhaps wouldn't have otherwise. And so the Lord is working with you and with them.
One of the women, Bridget, who had been the church warden, was quite a leader in the congregation, and she was one of the group of women I was involved in. She died, and her funeral was in a beautiful little village. I went. Bridget was buried in the churchyard, and I said, "Thank you, Bridget, for all you've done in my life."
Oh, that's lovely, Claire, but you've not told us yet about how you became a Catholic.
So in 2013, the vicar of the Anglican church where I went was leaving, and he was a good support to me. And also, there's a woman, Kilrick, she was moving on to become a vicar in her own parish. I'd been going to St. Bernard's constantly every year since past 20 odd years, and I thought it's time for me to move on. I don't know why, but I did. And I felt drawn to become a Catholic.
And you don't know why?
No, I didn't know any Catholic priests. How could I become a Catholic? Again, I'm sure God sends these people into my life. In the Anglican parish, there was a Sri Lankan woman her husband was a Catholic. They built a connection for me with the University Catholic Chaplaincy. And when I went, the priest happened to be, unusually, a Welsh priest. So I got to talk to Andrew. He did the RCIA with me. I was received into the Catholic Church, confirmed by the Archbishop of Liverpool, because he was a friend of the priest in the chaplaincy. It was significant in my life because when I first joined the Anglican Church at 12, I was also confirmed by the Archbishop of Wales. So, amusingly, I must be holy because I'm being confirmed by two archbishops.
Not many people in that situation.
Ever since, I've never looked back. I've really enjoyed being in the Catholic Church.
It's brought you to the centre of Ignatian spirituality, hasn't it, in the Catholic Church? And is that still an important spirituality for you?
Definitely, without any doubts at all. When I became a Catholic, because of my identity, I got invited to go to the National Catholic Safeguarding Annual Conference and speak, because they were interested. They wanted to know about trans issues. So I stood up there to talk, and somebody said, "Well, why have you become a Catholic?" And I said, "Well, God's called me to ministry many times in my life. I thought, if I become a Catholic, you won't get me anymore because there's no chance of women priests in the Catholic Church in my electorate." And everybody was laughing. Again, I still feel God's calling me to this ministry. And of course, it's you saying about praying. I remember talking to God once. I seem to be doing a lot of work with Muslim refugees, LGBT trans refugees. And I said, "God, what are you doing with me? I couldn't work that out, but I was definitely calling out a ministry with Muslim refugees into the UK. That's what God was calling me to do at that time. And I didn't understand it at all, but He supported me. And what I learned about Islam with one of my Muslim friends was God and Allah are the same God, Abrahamic faiths. And we have good Father Abraham as our common ancestral leader in both Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. I learned that in such a, not a theological sense or an academic sense, but in an actual down to earth way of living alongside some Muslim friends.
Yeah, it's good to be reminded of what we have in common. Claire, I wonder if we can move on. I'm interested in the Margaret Beaufort Institute and your work there. Tell us a bit about that then for listeners who don't know about the Institute and what you do.
Well, God looking after me without any doubt whatsoever, because just before COVID started, I saw in Catholic Tablet an advertisement for a senior fellow at Margaret Beaufort Institute in Cambridge, which essentially is an institute for women to do theological study, ordinary Catholic women. So I applied for it. I didn't hear anything for months. I got an email to say, we're so delighted to appoint you as Senior Fellow in Catholic Education at Margaret Beaufort Institute. That's my official title. The purpose of the fellowship was to give me an opportunity to study and write if I wanted to. I'm not a theologian, I'm a sociologist. So I thought, oh, and I wonder what's happening with trans children in schools. And I thought, oh, let's do a bit of work on that and set up a research project. And trans issues are toxic. I know that. And controversial.
Yes.
And I tried to apply for funding, but I couldn't get any. Couldn't get into schools. So I decided I would interview 18 to 28-year-olds. I wouldn't have to have all the hassle of getting into schools. Their memories of school would be fresh at 18 to 28. I wanted to know what their views were, not the parents. So I ended up interviewing 14 young people. I think 2 or 3 of them they had been in Catholic schools. So that's what I was doing from 2020 to last year, really, 2025.
And that led to the book. And what's the book called, just for listeners?
Wrong Bodies, Wrong Schools.
For listeners, I'll put a link in the episode notes. Sounds like an interesting read at this time that, as you say, it's a bit toxic just now, the trans, I hesitate to say debate.
It was fascinating. My motivation was there's so many problems going on in the world that trans issues are. But incidentally, and I think this is very influential even in Britain, is that President Trump, one of the first things he did was to enact his executive proclamations against trans people in the States. I think that's affected my book as well, because a lot of American places are banning books on trans issues and LGBT issues. So it is toxic. But I've been determined over the 5 years, these young children in school and the young people now, their stories need to be told.
Yes. And maybe, Claire, maybe you could just share with people something that you would want to say about how people talk about this issue, how Catholic people talk about this issue, how Catholic people respond to people going through these concerns about their identity or making changes that can be quite confronting. What do you think is helpful? What do you wish people could find in their hearts to say or do that would be helpful?
First of all, don't assume that the Catholic Church is all bad for trans people. Definitely not. Pope Francis, he was another big influence in becoming Catholic. Pope Francis got attached to a group of trans women in Italy, in the parish.
Yes.
And invited them to the Vatican to have lunch with him and stuff like that. So even though the rules of the Catholic Church haven't changed, actually on the ground, ordinary Catholics can be very supportive. What's been fabulous, and I'm not kidding, Teresa, this has been amazing. I worked with 5 or 6 priests. We had a lovely team, and they were so supportive of me. I did talk to one of the deanery synods about trans issues. They were delightful and so supportive. And one of them really turned around at the end of my talk and said, well, I've got no doubts in my mind that you were meant to be a woman when you were born. What a compliment of a Catholic priest.
I hope listeners aren't too surprised by that. I hope we're glad to hear that our clergy are supportive.
One of the people I interviewed went to a mixed Catholic state 6th form, and this young person said to me, well, I went in and there was all these crucifixes and things all around. I was terrified. But actually, one of the teachers there, a Catholic nun, took this trans person under her wing and was brilliant and supportive. So, what am I saying? I think if you look for trouble, you'll find it in the church. But if you're quiet, you will go about your daily life, go to mass and stuff, and your ministry in the church, you'll find people who are good, a great inspiration to them.
Well, it's been really lovely talking to you, Claire. Thanks so much for spending some time to share something of your life and your faith. And I'm struck by how, we started with little tiny you in the allotment with Philip. It's really amazing that there's been this sort of arc in your life of starting with somebody Catholic and coming to the church yourself such a long time later in some ways. I think you've uncovered for us there different ways in which the Lord has worked in your life and drawn you into so many different things. And I'm sure there are listeners for whom your time in the Anglican Church is also important, that they'll have something to resonate with there. I'm sure there are listeners who have Anglicans among their friends and family or have been Anglicans themselves. And so it's good to hear positive things about that church too. And it's good to hear that you have found a welcome in the Catholic Church and that there are people who are so supportive of you. I'll put some links to the St. Bino's Centre and to your work and the Margaret Beaufort Institute. You give us many things to put links to in the episode notes. So thank you so much. It's been lovely.
When you were saying that, Teresa, the thought came into my mind, going back to Philip in the garden. One of the parables is the mustard seed that grows into a beautiful tree that produces great. That's a good metaphor for my life, I think.
It is. You and Philip planting little seeds. Well, one day, God willing, Claire, in heaven, you'll be able to talk to Philip about it.
I hope so. I would love affection for him. Thank you, Teresa. I've enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you. I've enjoyed it too. Thanks so much for joining me on All Kinds of Catholic this time. I hope today's conversation has resonated with you. A new episode is released each Wednesday, and you can follow All Kinds of Catholic on the usual podcast platforms. Rate and review to help others find it. You can also follow us on social media at Kinds of Catholic. And remember, if you connect with us on Substack, you can comment on episodes and share your thoughts and be part of the dialogue there. Until the next time.